Ingersoll Lockwood's The Last President. Thank you for stopping by. I will begin immediately. Great as has been the world's wonder at the uprising of Mr. Bryan's struggling masses in the city by the sea, and the narrow escape of its magnificent homes from fire and brand, yet greater still was the wonderment when the news was flashed across the land that Chicago did not stand in need of a single federal soldier. Chicago is mad, but it is not the madness of joy. Chicago is in the hands of a mob, but it is a mob made up of her own people, noisy, rude, and boisterous, the natural exaltation of a suddenly enfranchised class, but bent on no other mischief than glorying over the villainous and self-seeking souls who have ground the faces of the poor and turned the pitiless screw of social and political power into the hearts of the common people, until its last thread had been reached and despair pressed in its lupine visage hard against the door of the laboring man. And yet at this moment, when the night air quivered with the mad vociferations of the common people, that the Lord had been good to them, that the wicked money changers had been driven from the temple, that the stony-hearted usurers were beaten at last, that the people's William was at the helm now, that peace and plenty would in a few moons come back to the poor man's cottage, that silver was king, king at last the world still went. Wondering why red-eyed anarchy, as she stood in the Haymarket Square with thin arms aloft, with wild mien and wilder gesticulation drew no bomb of dynamite from her bosom. Maybe it's gesticulation, to hurl at the hated minions of the law, who were silent spectators of this delirium of popular joy. Why was it thus? Look at you, shall now know why. White-robed peace, step with turbulent band, and turned its thought from red-handed pillage. He was there, the master spirit to hold them in leash. He and he alone had lifted Bryan to his great eminence. Without these 24 electoral votes, Bryan had been doomed, hopelessly doomed. He and he alone held the great commonwealth of the West hard and fast in the Democratic line. Now, I should say something. Back in the time this book was written, Democrats were more like Republicans, and Republicans were more like Democrats. There was a shift in the parties, so, which end is up. Okay, so basically, Bryan's would be more of a Republican now. So let's go on. So Democratic line, hence he came as conqueror, as kingmaker, and the very walls of the sky-touching edifices trembled as he was dragged through the crowded streets by this orderly mob, and 10 times 10,000 of his creatures bellowed his name and shook their hats aloft in mad exultation. You're our savior! You've cleaned the temple of liberty and its foul horde of users. We salute you. We call you kingmaker. Bryan shall call you master too. You shall have your reward. You shall stand behind the throne. Your wisdom shall make us whole. You shall purge the land of this unlawful crowd of money-lenders. You shall save the Republic. You are greater than Washington. You are a better friend of ours than Lincoln. You'll do more for us than Grant. We're your slaves. We salute you. We thank you. We bless you. Hurrah, hurrah, hurrah. But yet this vast throng of tamed monsters, this mighty mob of momentarily good-natured haters of established order, broke away from the master's control for a few brief moments and dipped their hands in the enemy's blood. The deed was swift, and it was terrible. There were but 4 of them, unarmed, unpleasure-bent. At the sight of these men, 1,000 throats belched out a deep and awful growl of hatred. They were brave men, and backed against the wall to die like brave men, stricken down, beaten, torn, trampled, dragged. It was quick work. They had faced howling savages in the far west, painted monsters in human form, but never had they heard such yells leave the throats of men. And so they died, 4 brave men, clad in the blue livery of the Republic, whose only crime was that some months back, against the solemn protest of the master, their comrades had set foot on the soil of the Commonwealth and saved the metropolis of the West from the hands of the same mob. And so Chicago celebrated the election of the new president, who was to free the land from the grasp of the moneylenders and undo the bad business of the years of unholy union between birders and sellers of human toil and the lawmakers of the land. Throughout the length and breadth of the South and beyond the great divide, the news struck hamlet and village like the glad tidings of a new evangel, almost as potent for human happiness as the heavenly message of 2,000 years ago. Bells rang out in joyful acclaim, and the very stars trembled at the telling, and the telling over and over, of what had been done for the poor man by his brethren of the North. And around the blazing pine knots of the southern cabin, and in the front of the mining campfires of the far west, the cry went up, "Silver is king! Silver is king!" Black palms and white were clasped in this strange love feast, and the dark-skinned grandchild no longer felt the sting of the lash on his sire's shoulder. All was peace and good will, for the people were at last victorious over their enemies, who had taxed and tithed them into a very living death. Now the laborer would not only be worthy of his hire, but would be paid to him in a people's dollar for the people's good. And now the rich man's coffers would be made to yield up their ill-gotten gain, and the sun would look upon this broad and fair land and find no man without a market for the product of his labors. Henceforth, the rich man should, as was right and proper, pay a royal sum for the privilege of his happiness and take the nation's taxes on his broad shoulders where they belong. Should I go to chapter 3? How many pages was this? I could go another chapter maybe. And then we have to go nighty-night. Oops. I put this in a file on my desktop instead of having to go online. Chapter 3. I'm going to have to end it after this one. And the Baron Trump one, I did too. So I'm just going to leave it at this today. And then I'll do one each day, if possible. Okay. The pens of many writers would not suffice to describe with anything like historical fullness and precision the wild scenes of excitement which on the morning after Election Day burst forth on the floors of the various exchanges throughout the Union. The larger and more important the money center, the deeper, blacker, and heavier with despair which sank upon them after the violent ambulations of protest, defiance, and execration that had subsided. With some it seemed that visions of their swift but sure impoverishment only served to transform the dark and dismal drama of revolution and disintegration into a side-splitting farce, and they greeted the prospective loss of their millions with loud guffaws and indescribable antics of horseplay and unseemly mirth. As the day wore on, the news became worse and worse. It was only too apparent that the House of Representatives of the 55th Congress would be controlled by the combined vote of the Populists and Free Silver men, while the wild joy with which the entire South welcomed the election of Bryan and the seawall left little doubt in the minds of the Northern people that the Southern senators would, to a man, range themselves on the administration side of the great conflict into which the Republic was soon to be precipitated. Now, an interesting fact about this is that William Jennings Bryan lost this election. This was written during the time of that in history, and there was, this is when The Wizard of Oz came out too. Bryan wanted gold-backed dollars, and a lot of people would say that The Wizard of Oz was written with the yellow brick road alluding to that, but anyway, let's just go back to this. So, let's see. Okay, Seawall left little doubt in the minds of the Northern people that the Southern senators would, to a man, range themselves on the administration side of the great conflict into which the Republic was soon to be precipitated. Add to these 20 senators of the free silver states of the North, and the new president would have the Congress of the Republic. Let me center this a little better. That's right. Okay. At his back, there would be nothing to stand between him and the realization of those schemes which an exuberant fancy, untamed by the hand of experience and scornful of the leading strings of wisdom, can conjure up. Did we say nothing? Nay, not so. For the Supreme Court was still there, and yet Justice Field had come fully up to the 18th milestone in the journey of life, and Justice Gray was nearly 70, while one or two other members of this high court of judicia held to their lives with feeble grasp. Even in due and orderly course of events, why might there not come vacancies, and then? In spite of this nameless dread that rested upon so many of our people and chilled the very blood of the country's industries, the new year '97 came hopefully, serenely, almost defiantly in. There was an indiscernible something in the air, a spirit of political devil-me-care, a feeling that the old order had passed away and that the Republic had entered into the womb of time and been born again. This sentiment began to give outward and visible signs of its existence and growth in the remote agricultural districts of the South and Far West. They threw aside their working implements, loitered about, gathered in groups, and the words Washington, White House, Silver, Bryan offices, 2 for 1, the South's day, reign of the common people, taxes, incomes, years of jubilee, free coinage, Wall Street, Altgeld, Tillman, Peffery, Coxey were whispered in a mysterious way, with head noddings and pursing of mouths. As January wore away and February, slipping by, brought Bryan's inauguration nearer and nearer, the groups melted into groups. The groups melted into groups, okay. Thought I read that wrong. And it was only too apparent that from a dozen different points in the South, the Northwest Coxey armies were forming for an advance on Washington. In some instances, they were well clad and well provisioned. In others, they were little better than great bands of hungry and restless men, demoralized by idleness and wrought up by a strange degree of mental excitement by the extravagant harangues of their leaders, who were animated with but one thought, namely to make use of these vast crowds of silver pilgrims, as they called themselves, to back up their claims for public office. These crowds of deluded people were well named silver pilgrims, for hundreds of them carried in hempen bags, this is before pot was illegal, pieces of silver in 99 cases of 100 plated stuff of little value, which unscrupulous dealers and peddlers had palmed off upon them as sterling, with the promises that once in Washington the United States Mint would coin their metal into Bryan dollars, giving 2 for 1 in payment for it. While these motley armies marched upon the capital of the Republic, the railway trains night and day brought vast crowds of new men, politicians of low degree, men out of employment, drunken and disgruntled mechanics, farmers' sons, to seek their fortunes under the reign of the people, healers and hangers-on of ward bosses, old men who had not tasted office for 30 years, and more, all inspired by Mr. Bryan's declaration that the American people are not in favor of life tenure in the civil service, that a permanent office-holding class is not in harmony with our institutions, that a fixed term in the appointed offices would open the public service to a larger number of citizens without impairing its efficiency, all bearing new besoms in their hands or across their shoulders, each and every one of them, I gotta scooch this over, supremely confident that their distribution of the spoils, something would surely fall to his share, since they were the common people, who were so dear to Mr. Bryan, and who had made him president in the very face of the prodigious opposition of the rich man, whose coffers had been thrown wide open, all to no purpose, and in spite, too, of the satanic and truly devilish power of that hell upon earth known as Wall Street, which had sweated gold in vain in its desperate efforts to fasten the chains of trusts and the claws of soulless monsters known as corporations upon these very common people, soon to march in triumph before the silver chariot of the young conqueror from the West. We shall read chapter 4 tomorrow. Thank you for your time. Appreciate each and every one of you. Good night and sweet dreams. Love you lots. Goodbye.